This is a long story. First, I wanted to go to teaching, to ancient languages, to history, but about age 12, I thought I should go to medicine. I had surgery and I got exposed to hospitals, and it's very interesting that this was not welcome. I remember that teachers of mine went to my father and said, well, it's such a pity that he takes medicine. Medicine is such an inferior discipline. You may laugh about it, but medicine had a very relatively low reputation in Germany after the war, because many had studied medicine in order to escape from military service, and the medical crimes had become public. So it was not a page of glory to decide to become medicine, but I was so fascinated by the topics in medicine, and I simply, despite the argument of my father and of my teachers, I did it. Well, this was much against my will. I was with a scholarship in Zurich, in the Kantonsspital, by the then equivalent of Forschungsgemeinschaft. And then I went to St. Louis. I knew Neil Bricker, but I was completely uninterested in nephrology. I worked on vascular disease. I did Dickens-Horriger shunt in the aortas and that kind of work. And when I came back, our urologists wanted to start transplantation. So one day I was called to the chief of department and said, Ritz, next Monday you will start dialysis. I said, sir, I did not go to St. Louis to churn the urea mill. I want to continue on vascular disease. And he says, well, you don't have to. You can go to any German university you wish. So I knew I had to do it. That's how it started, but very soon I got fascinated. I liked it, and it was not love at first sight, but it was a happy marriage.
No regrets?
No regrets, certainly not, no.
And
nowadays, I would have serious thoughts, because I think the standing of nephrology, at least in our country, has diminished relative to other disciplines like oncology or cardiovascular disease. And I think we have to seriously reconsider the format of how internal medicine is done nowadays. There is so much overlap between the disciplines, so much interaction, that I doubt whether the type of nephrology that we did in the 60s and 70s is still appropriate in the next 2 or 3 decades, which has consequences for the training, which has also consequences for science. I think nowadays you can do forefront research in nephrology only if you are knowledgeable beyond the borders of the discipline. Well, of course, everyone has his own favors. My first love affair was calcium metabolism. The second love affair was diabetes. And currently I have a love affair with aldosterone and mineralocorticoids. So it changes with the availability of methodology, of cooperating partners. And it's very difficult to feel bored when doing scientific work in nephrology. Well, I was very lucky. The one person which impressed me most was the late Professor Ulrich in the Max Planck in Frankfurt, I never worked on basic research, but he helped me in a lot of things relating to methodology, how to attack a problem, and he was an absolute role model for me. I also had a good friend of mine who helped me a lot not by providing support or active work, but by providing a lot of interesting ideas. This was August Heitland from Würzburg. And we had quite a good generation of nephrologists, scientifically interested nephrologists, about the same age as me, and it was fun to work with all of them. There are too many to name them, but in the 70s and 80s there was a lot of fun in doing research. Well, it is very important because your psyche very much depends on whether you are working in a conducive environment of trust or whether there is infighting, which unfortunately is not unheard of in academic universities. I was lucky. I had fantastic collaborators. With perhaps one exception, I never had a major fight. I fell prey to one of my collaborators whom I married, so it was both conducive to medicine and conducive to private life. Well, there are different formats, of course. You can be a brilliant teacher and a not ideal practical physician. You can be a brilliant scientist without the skills you need in medicine, and I encountered both. And there are the very admirable ones who are able to be excellent on these two planes. I think it is absolutely important to have some kind of, as we say, wavelength with the patient, to be respected on the one hand, but also to be appreciated on the other hand. And I had wonderful relationships. I can tell an anecdote. I was then, when I started dialysis, 33 years. And we had a 65-year-old patient, and she came in with 5-7 kilos overhydration. And I said, "Ma'am, I don't accept it." And I was surrounded by patients. And she said, "How do you dare speaking to an elderly lady? I was seeing you in the kindergarten with shit in your pants." And of course, everyone laughed. My reputation was demolished, but fate is very just. She came back in 3 weeks' time with pulmonary edema at 8 o'clock at night. And I didn't have a car. I came with bicycle, jumped through the window, put her on dialysis, and from there on I was a saint and widely expected. This spread like wildfire. So there are different ways of interaction, of course. Not all patients are very likable. Many of them are so nice that they will be accepted by you as if they were family partners. The whole spectrum of humanity you will meet in medicine, and particularly in nephrology, because you don't see them just for a few days, like after myocardial infarction. You accompany them during lifetime. And for some 8 or 10 weeks ago, I had to go to the 40th celebration of dialysis of a patient of mine who went on home dialysis, had the wisdom to marry a very efficient, very attractive nurse who takes care of him, and this was like, he was like a family member to me.
40 years. Experience.
I mean, there are of course advances on different levels. Let's say the understanding of contamination of dialysate water was certainly one of the breakthroughs, that endotoxin is killing patients, causing a type of amyloidosis on the one hand. On the other hand, the discovery of the receptor for angiotensin II and endothelin has led to a revolution of our interventions to manage patients with kidney disease. I think if we think in the return of better life expectancy, I think the single most important advances overall, not for specific individual diseases, were blood pressure lowering, were control of volume problems with appropriate diuretics, and there is now a whole plethora of new developments, being it bardoxolone to interfere with oxidative stress, endothelin blockade, which is coming, just examples which come immediately to one's mind. There is so much going on that I'm very optimistic that nephrology will very much look differently in 20 years' time compared to 20 years ago. And we wouldn't have dreamed in the 70s of what we have now in our hands concerning interventions, not to speak of transplantation, which has made spectacular progress. One thing I liked very much is teaching. And I'm very proud that I have a great, almost company size of people who were trained by me. This is one area where I'm very proud of. The second are scientific achievements. I had the great luck to work with a brilliant histopathologist and immunopathologist with whom I did a lot of work on cardiovascular problems and in kidney disease, and a second one with whom we did work on the evolution of the kidney and how problems during pregnancy impact on the future life, including renal outcome of the fetus. This is an exciting area which is currently worked upon by me, where I'm very proud. I was very much interested in diabetic nephropathy, and I think I made major contributions to this area, which comprises 50% of patients who go to end-stage kidney disease and are dialyzed or transplanted. So there are people who are monocular in their arrangement and in their perspective. I try to be at least biocular, perhaps multiocular, with my interests and my perspectives. Difficult for me, out of the top of my head, I had so many pleasant and rewarding episodes, which I would prefer. If I think about the practical consequences and impact which the finding of the cardiac and vascular changes in uremia had on our concepts of how the cardiovascular risk is increased in renal disease, I think this is one major scientific contribution. If I think about the epidemiological impact, I think our work on diabetic nephropathy raised the awareness of the incoming tide. I still remember when we found in Heidelberg that 50% of patients admitted for end-stage kidney disease were diabetics. I was attacked in Germany. It was felt that this was slobby work. And I could prove that we did oral glucose tolerance test on everyone who came. And we found that 20% of the patients had normal glucose at fasting and a pathological glucose tolerance test. And the explanation is that they no longer feel well in pre-terminal uremia. They lose weight. They are no longer hyperglycemic. And people took only glycemia. And we did the glucose tolerance test, and our figures have been umpteen times confirmed. So I think this is reason to be proud that after a lot of condemnation of my approach, finally everyone agrees.
In an ideal way.
I mean, I'm an optimist, and I think that 80 or 90% of the relationships run very well. There is still much respect for the work of the physicians. Unfortunately, the medical legal problems start arising in our country as well. It's no comparison with the USA, where you have to do defensive medicine. But there is some interference. But on average, and this varies very much whether you are on the countryside or whether you are in a metropolitan area. Fortunately, we lived in a small city where I knew a lot of people because I went to kindergarten, to school, to university, all in the same city, and I was known and my wife is working there. It was a very pleasant relationship on average. Of course, there are always unpleasant experiences. I never had a medical legal problem, which is important, which increases, unfortunately, across the Western world, including Germany. I never had it. And if I had to do it again, I would do it the same way. This is an act of Christian charity. Thank you.
Before 1990 or 1995, they are simply forgotten.
Not only the youngsters, I can tell you, even established nephrologists, I don't want to mention a name, he was asked about someone, I don't want to name, who published superbly in the 60s, he didn't know. Because the PubMed doesn't go to. I mean, PubMed is a great thing,
Yeah.
but it, of course, it creates a climate and a culture where everything that was before 1970 is forgotten.
Yeah, sure. But you know, Gabriel Richiero insists very often on the importance of history in medicine, and I think history is very, very important for
If one doesn't overdo it, I think it is immensely educational.
Yeah.
One can overdo it. I mean, I knew people who
In a reasonable way.
who created antibodies against history, but
But if you do it in a reasonable way, the history of science is absolutely key to the understanding of what's going on.
absolutely. You are talking to the converted one. I am converted already.
So tell us about your conversion to the interest in history of medicine.
Well, I'm interested in the history in general, and before the age 12, I temporarily even gave it some thought to go into history, because we had 9 years of Greek and of Latin, but from the very beginning on, I had an interest in ancient literature, and I wrote a number of articles on this, because I felt that it is a pity that some of the geniuses are so thoroughly forgotten, and also the private life of these people. I can tell the example of Henley, who was a rebellious person who was kicked out of Germany because he was for liberation, and went to Zurich, and as a professor he fell in love with a modest girl whom he educated in a gymnasium, who had to learn Latin, to play piano for 3 years, and then he married her. And the exchange of letters is still a piece of literature which is well read in Germany. And the sad thing is that groundbreaking work is often completely forgotten. This gentleman was the first to note that there were small structures in pus, and said, well, this must be bacteria. And he had a med student, Koch, whom everyone knows in bacteriology, and he put him on this topic. And that's why Koch discovered all these bacteria from, such a curriculum vitae is of course absolutely fascinating. And he must have been a brilliant teacher. The students in Heidelberg made what they call in German Fackelzug, burning rods to celebrate and to honor a outstanding teacher. So it never happened to me that they made a procession with burning rods first, but it is moving to see what kind of impact you can have by your teaching. That's why I mentioned this episode.
Would you comment on that?
Yes, certainly. I had the great luck to meet Scribner, and Scribner even exchanged letters with me, and I know the story how chronic hemodialysis started. I mean, dialysis started even in the 20s in a very primitive fashion, as we just had discussed, and acute renal failure like Wilhelm Kolff and the work in Lund started in 1945. But the problem was the vascular access, and this story of how in collaboration with Boeing Airlines he was able to find a non-clotting vascular access in a patient where he was desperate because he thought it was acute renal failure and it didn't come off. This was then a world sensation. And I know from people who worked with Scribner that this Clyde Shields, who was the first patient, that he was a fantastic technician, and all doctors, all junior doctors were delighted because he could repair every car problem they had. These are the small side shows of early nephrology. And Scribner, for instance, must have been a charismatic educator. I had the luck to meet a lady who was one of the 10 first who got EPO, and was amongst the 10 or 15 first who was taken on dialysis by Scribner. And she was enthusiastic how she was taught by Scribner to reduce salt intake. And if you say, well, this is 50 or 60 years old, this problem has been solved, it has not been solved. I think this is the major problem of our cardiovascular issues in dialysis. And it can be done, as Scribner showed and as this lady showed. Well, when I was age 13 or 14, I played piano, I even gave concertos. My piano teacher, she was educated by Max Reger and was in the conservatorium in Paris, and in August 1914 she had to leave. But she was a brilliant pianist, and I loved to do it, but When I went into medicine, I simply didn't have the time. This was one thing. The second is art. I often travel, go to the museum, paintings. I had hobby painting. Again, I abandoned this because I simply didn't have the time. So nephrology is my first love, but the fourth or fifth is painting, where I'm modestly good. My wife is even more derogative about it, or the quality, but I still like it. It's not exactly my flavor of interest, but I can easily see that one can be a good physician and a poet. And there are a number of examples in German medicine. Since I'm not, I was not given the gift of being a poet, I'm not so keen on it. Of course, I like German poetry, Goethe, of course, but it's not a main area of my interest. Music is, I would give any Goethe poem for one of the concertos of Mozart. I'm not terribly convinced that specific courses on humanity in medicine are necessary. I think the example, giving an example how you handle a patient, how you care for him, whether you show compassion or not, is much more educational for the junior staff than having formal instructions, as in some universities has been done. But there is no question, since Hippocrates we know, that compassion and interaction with the patient regard him more than a lump of meat with some malfunction is essential to have humanitarian medicine. And a student who was in my semester had a father who was involved in these medical experiments in Buchenwald, and I can tell you, if you hear about this, you are cured for your life about how to handle a patient.
Broadly seen.
Well, in teaching, I think the worst to do is to overload people and to tell them a lot of irrelevant findings which are not impacting on how to treat and recognize disease. There are so many recent findings in theoretical medicine which are irrelevant to clinical practice, which are unnecessarily taught. But I think the basics must be taught. And I think you are not a good physician if you're not up to date to understand the function of an enzyme, the genetic translation, the mechanisms. This you have to know. I think the secret of teaching is not to overload people, to repeat, to summarize, and to have once and again a joke and something amusing, so that those who started falling asleep are woken up. Be educated.
Or no.
I think for the clinician the best education is to join with someone who is knowledgeable and to see how taking the history, how establishing a treatment plan, how this is handled in praxis. And I think this is the best you can give to your students and your collaborators. I don't think everyone has to do research. There are people who have a talent in research. There are those who don't have a talent. It is much more important to have a structured approach, an intelligent approach. This needs not necessarily be research. And one thing where everyone, even the one who has no interest in the research, can do a lot of good and help progress in medicine is to have good documentation and to participate in history taking and in having good epidemiological data. This, I think, everyone should support nowadays. And in the age of electronic information, this is no longer the kind of problem it had been 30 years ago. First, you must love the discipline. Personally, I don't have much resonance with pediatrics, for instance. My wife is pediatrician and she loves it. I was forced to do nephrology. I got to love it. I think there must be an element of interest and personal satisfaction. And this is the most important one. I would be unhappy as a surgeon, but I have friends who love to do surgery, and I think this element of being satisfied, of loving your job, is the most important element.